Oishee Rahman, the once bright daughter of respected police officer Anwar Rahman and gentle schoolteacher Salma Rahman, shocked the entire nation when she confessed to a crime so unthinkable that it shattered the very idea of family. She killed her own parents, turning their picture-perfect home into the scene of an unspeakable betrayal. The Rahman family lived in a house that, to outsiders, looked like the very picture of respect and stability. People walking past would see a well-kept garden, windows cleaned regularly, and a front door that was always locked at night without fail. Neighbors often spoke highly of them, remarking that Anwar Rahman, the father, was a man who carried himself with authority and integrity. As a senior police officer, he was respected in his community and known for his uncompromising stance on crime. He never bent rules, never showed favoritism, and earned his position through sheer discipline. His wife, Salma Rahman, was equally admired, but in a softer, gentler way. She was a teacher who guided children with patience and kindness, the kind of woman who remembered the names of every student she taught. Together, Anwar and Salma were seen as a perfect balance, strong and strict on one side, calm and nurturing on the other. But appearances can often be deceiving, and behind the walls of their home, another story was unfolding. Their daughter, Oishee Rahman, was the center of it. At first glance, she was like any other teenager, walking to school in a neat uniform and returning home with her books. Yet those who looked closely began to notice subtle changes. She spent less time at home, avoided family dinners, and often locked herself in her room with music blaring from behind the door. Friends and neighbors who once described her as polite now whispered about her cold stares and distracted demeanor. The light that once shone in her eyes seemed to be fading. For Anwar, this shift was unacceptable. He believed in order, structure, and absolute obedience. His profession had made him view the world in black and white, right or wrong, lawful or unlawful. He expected his daughter to follow the same strict path he had carved for himself. He pushed her to excel academically, to stay away from distractions, to live by the same rigid discipline he had always practiced. Salma, on the other hand, tried to soften his approach, but even she carried her own expectations. She wanted Oishee to be graceful, refined, and obedient, a young woman who would one day make the family proud. Oishee felt suffocated by these demands. She was intelligent but restless, carrying a storm inside her that her parents never seemed to understand. At school, she drifted away from her studies and sought comfort in new friendships. One of those friendships was with Rifat Karim, a boy who lived on the edge of rules and consequences. With him, Oishee found a world completely different from her parents' controlled household. Late-night outings, experiments with substances, and secretive behaviors gave her a taste of freedom she had never known. To Oishee, that rebellion felt like oxygen, even though it was slowly leading her down a dangerous path. Back at home, arguments grew more frequent. What began as small disagreements about homework or chores quickly escalated into heated conflicts. Anwar's stern lectures clashed with Oishee's defiance, while Salma's pleas for peace went unheard. The walls of the house, once filled with warmth, now absorbed the tension of raised voices and cold silences. Neighbors occasionally caught hints of this discord, a slammed door, a sharp cry, but they dismissed it as ordinary family struggle. No one could have guessed how deep the fracture truly ran. By the time Oishee reached her late teens, she was living a double life. During the day, she still played the role of the obedient daughter in front of relatives and outsiders. But once night fell, she slipped into her other identity, meeting friends in hidden corners of the city, pushing boundaries further than before. Each step she took away from her parents' expectations pushed her closer to a line that once crossed could never be undone. What Anwar and Salma failed to see was that their daughter's silence had grown louder than any word she could have spoken. They still clung to the image of the little girl they had raised, while the young woman standing before them had already become a stranger in their own home. The family portrait hanging in their living room, showing 3 smiling faces, no longer reflected the truth. The cracks in their picture-perfect life had spread too far, and the darkness that was growing inside Oishee was preparing to break free in ways they could never have imagined. The night that would change everything began like any other in the Rahman household. The weather was heavy with humidity, and the streets outside were unusually quiet, as though the city itself had decided to rest. From the outside, their home looked calm and ordinary. Lights dimmed, curtains drawn, a place of security. But behind those walls, something unthinkable was about to happen. The house was silent, but it was not the silence of peace. It was a silence that held weight, a silence that would soon turn into a mystery that stunned an entire community. When the following morning came, word spread quickly. Anwar Rahman and his wife, Salma, had been found dead in their bed. The discovery was made by a distant relative who had come to visit, only to be greeted by locked doors and no response. After some hesitation, the relative entered the home and stumbled upon the unimaginable sight. The couple lay side by side, their bodies still, their room undisturbed, their belongings untouched. There were no broken windows, no forced entry, no sign of a robbery gone wrong. Everything about the crime scene suggested precision, control, and a disturbing kind of calm. News of the deaths traveled fast. Neighbors gathered outside in disbelief, whispering among themselves, questioning how such a tragedy could strike a family that had seemed so respectable. Some wept openly, remembering Anwar's dedication as a police officer, a man who had devoted his life to fighting crime, and Salma's quiet presence as a teacher, who had shaped the lives of countless children. It felt unreal that two people so deeply rooted in their community could vanish overnight. Yet amidst the shock, one detail stood out. Their daughter Oishee was nowhere to be found. She had not been in the house when the bodies were discovered, and her absence immediately shifted the tone of the whispers outside. Where was she? Why had she not been? The disappearance was troubling, and to many it raised questions they dared not voice aloud. Within hours, the case was assigned to Detective Adeel Murad, a man whose career had been built on solving complex and unsettling crime. He approached the scene with practiced eyes, scanning every corner, every detail. The bedsheets were neatly in place, the drawers closed, the doors locked from inside. Nothing about the crime suggested chaos or panic. It had been carried out with methodical precision, and that alone disturbed him deeply. A crime inside a family home, committed without struggle, usually pointed to someone close, someone who had access, someone who knew the routines, someone who belonged inside those walls. While investigators worked through the morning, a breakthrough came. Oishee was located at the small apartment of her friend, Rifat Karim. She appeared dazed, withdrawn, and unbothered by the chaos surrounding her. Taken into custody for questioning, her behavior immediately unsettled those watching. She showed little reaction to the news of her parents' deaths. No outward grief, no visible shock. To the investigators, her indifference was telling. A daughter discovering the murder of her parents would usually collapse under the weight of the news, but Oishee seemed as though she had already known. Detective Murad grew more convinced that this case was not about outside intruders or random crime. It was about family, about fractures hidden within the walls of the Rahman household. As he pieced together the early evidence, he realized that this was not an impulsive act of rage, but something more deliberate. There were no signs of forced entry because the killer had walked in free. There was no struggle because the victims had trusted the presence in their home. Everything about the crime spoke of betrayal from within. The investigation pressed forward with urgency. Officers interviewed neighbors, relatives, and acquaintances, all of whom confirmed what Murad already suspected. The Rahman family had been troubled in recent years, their daughter increasingly distant, her lifestyle clashing with her parents' values. Some admitted to overhearing arguments. Others recalled seeing Oishee wandering the streets late at night. Slowly, a picture began to form of a girl who was spiraling out of control, pulling away from the very people who had tried to guide her. Still, Murad knew better than to rush to conclusion. Appearances could mislead, and he needed something more concrete than suspicions. But in his gut, the silence of that house told him a story. It was the silence of a family breaking apart, the silence of trust shattered from the inside. And as he prepared to interrogate Oishee, He knew this was only the beginning of uncovering a truth darker than anyone could imagine. The investigation into the deaths of Anwar and Salma Rahman quickly moved from the walls of their home into the unseen corners of their daughter's life. As detectives sifted through every trace of her recent behavior, a disturbing picture began to emerge. Oishee had not simply been a troubled teenager under pressure. She had been leading an entirely different existence outside the reach of her parents. It was a life filled with secrecy, risk, and decisions that hinted at a mind pulling further away from reason. Her school records showed a decline that had started slowly but became more obvious over time. Teachers described her as bright but distracted, a student who once engaged with lessons but gradually slipped into apathy. Assignments went unfinished, attendance became irregular, and eventually her name was mentioned more for her absence than her presence. At the same time, her social circle shifted. The friends her parents once approved of were replaced by people with questionable reputations. Among them was Rifat Karim, a young man whose charm masked a dangerous life. He became her closest companion, someone who introduced her to late-night gatherings, substances that blurred reality, and habits that took her further from the disciplined world her parents demanded she live in. Detectives uncovered phone records that showed frequent communication between Oishee and Rifat, especially during late hours. Their messages revealed a deep resentment toward her home life. She often described her father's rules as unbearable, her mother's expectations as suffocating, and her family home as a prison she longed to escape. While many teenagers expressed frustration, what investigators found in her hidden diary painted a darker picture. Scribbled in untidy handwriting were chilling thoughts about disappearing forever, breaking free by any means necessary, and the recurring fantasy of silencing the voices that controlled her. The more the detectives learned, the clearer it became that Oishee was living in two worlds. In one she remained the Rahman's daughter, maintaining the appearance of routine, attending family gatherings, smiling in photos, speaking politely when necessary. In the other, she lived recklessly, rejecting everything her parents valued. These two versions of her were growing further apart, and the tension of holding them both together had become unbearable. What troubled Detective Adeel Murad most was not simply the evidence of rebellion, but the cold logic behind it. This was not a girl making random mistakes. It was someone methodically carving out a secret existence. Friends recalled how she often spoke of wanting to disappear, but behind her words there was no desperation, only a strange kind of calm, as if she had already accepted where her path was leading. That unsettling calm mirrored the crime scene itself, which had been staged with precision and devoid of chaos. The role of Rifat could not be ignored. Though he denied any involvement in the murders, his influence over Oishee was undeniable. He admitted that she often spoke of her hatred for the rules that governed her life, and that she believed her parents would never allow her to live freely. He painted himself as a listener, someone who merely absorbed her frustrations, but the detectives suspected he had fueled her defiance. Yet without clear evidence tying him to the crime, the focus remained squarely on Oishee. Family acquaintances struggled to reconcile the girl they once knew with the suspect now sitting in custody. Some remembered her as quiet and respectful. Others described her recent years as filled with distance and hostility. Relatives admitted that Anwar and Salma had worried constantly about their daughter, but their pride prevented them from seeking help outside the family. In their silence, the storm inside Oishee only grew stronger. As Murad pieced together these fragments, he began to understand that the motive was not about money or opportunity but something more primal: freedom. To Oishee, her parents' love had twisted into control, their guidance into oppression. The very home that had been her shelter now felt like a cage. In her fractured mind, the only way out was to destroy the walls completely. The tragedy was that those walls were not made of bricks or boundaries, but of the two people who had devoted their lives to raising her. The revelation left investigators unsettled. Crimes committed by strangers were one thing, but when a child turned against parents with such cold determination, it shook even seasoned officers. The double life of Oishee Rahman was no longer hidden. It stood exposed for everyone to see, and with every detail that surfaced, the question grew heavier. Had she been planning this all along, waiting for the moment to sever ties in the most irreversible way possible. Detective Adeel Murad knew the interrogation of Oishee Rahman would determine the course of the entire case. From the moment she was brought in, her demeanor unsettled everyone in the room. She appeared detached, her gaze shifting between the walls and the table in front of her, as though she was somewhere else entirely. For a teenager accused of the brutal deaths of both parents, her composure was unnerving. There were no tears, no desperate questions, no sign of Instead, she seemed resigned, as though she had already accepted her role in the tragedy that had unfolded. The first hours of questioning revealed little. Her answers were short, sometimes vague, sometimes sharp, but never emotional. Murad pressed harder, laying out details of the crime scene, the locked doors, the lack of forced entry, the precision of the attack. He wanted to see if any flicker of guilt or fear appeared on her face. For a long time, there was nothing. Then, slowly, fragments of the truth began to slip out. Oishee described a life that had felt unbearable. To outsiders, her parents were respected figures, symbols of order and kindness. To her, they were relentless oppressors. Every decision she made was scrutinized, every step watched, every word judged. She painted a picture of a home where love felt like chains and guidance felt like imprisonment. She spoke of nights spent lying awake, suffocated by expectations, consumed by thoughts of escape. In her mind, freedom had become an unreachable dream, one that could only be seized through drastic action. As the hours dragged on, she confessed more. On the night of the murders, she had returned home after hours away, her mind clouded by substances she had taken earlier. The anger she carried, fueled by weeks of growing defiance, had reached a breaking point. She moved through the house quietly, slipping into her parents' room while they slept. What she did next, she described with a disturbing calmness. There was no struggle, no chance for them to fight back. It was swift, calculated, and executed with precision. When it was over, she washed her hands, changed her clothes, and walked out as though nothing had happened. To Detective Murad, the confession was chilling, not only for its content, but for its delivery. There was no remorse in her tone, no visible weight in her words. It was as if she had separated herself from the act, recounting it like a memory that belonged to someone else. Psychologists later suggested that she had detached emotionally from her actions, numbing herself to the reality of what she had done. For Murad, however, it was clear she had committed the crime with intent and clarity. The investigators sought to understand whether Rifat Karim had played a role in encouraging or assisting her. Under pressure, Oishee admitted that she often spoke to him about her hatred for her parents, but she insisted the decision was hers alone. She claimed Rifat had listened but never acted, though suspicion lingered. Even if he had not been present that night, his influence had shaped the rebellion that consumed her. The confession spread like wildfire once it reached the media. A daughter admitting to killing her parents was more than just a crime. It was a betrayal that defied comprehension. News reports replayed her words, analysts debated her mental state, and the public reacted with a mixture of horror and disbelief. Some blamed the parents' strictness, others blamed Oishee's choices, but no explanation could make sense of the act itself. As the confession was documented, Murad reflected on the deeper tragedy. This was not a story of greed, nor of revenge, but of a child's fractured perception of love and control. Anwar and Salma had spent their lives trying to mold their daughter into the person they believed she should be, never realizing the weight of their expectations was breaking her spirit. Oishee, instead of seeking help or escape through ordinary means, had chosen the most irreversible path imaginable. The coldness of her words stayed with everyone who heard them. She had not killed in anger that burned hot and reckless. She had killed in anger that had been simmering quietly for years, anger that had turned into a calculated decision. And in the end, the silence of her parents' bedroom spoke louder than any scream could have. With the confession recorded, and the evidence aligning against her, the case was nearly closed. But for those who had followed it from the beginning, questions still lingered. Was this the act of a young woman consumed by rebellion, or the breakdown of someone whose mind could no longer distinguish between love and control? The answers were complicated, but one thing was certain: Oishee Rahman had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed.
and the consequences of that choice would follow her for the rest of her life. The courtroom was filled to capacity on the day the trial of Oishee Rahman began. Journalists crowded every corner. Cameras flashed as guards escorted her inside, and the quiet murmur of the audience created a charged atmosphere. People had come not only to hear the verdict but to see with their own eyes the teenager who had admitted to killing her own parent. To them she was no longer simply a daughter, but a symbol of a crime so unnatural it seemed impossible to comprehend. Every movement she made, every glance she gave, was analyzed and discussed. Some saw defiance in her posture, others saw emptiness, but all agreed there was little sign of remorse. The prosecution laid out its case with methodical precision. They described the Rahman family as respected, disciplined and strict but loved. They presented evidence from the crime scene, pointing to the lack of forced entry, the controlled nature of the attack, and the confession Oishee had given during questioning. The diary entries were read aloud in court, passages filled with anger, resentment and disturbing fantasies about silencing her parents. The words painted a portrait of a girl who had not only thought about ending their lives, but had carried that thought with determination. Each piece of evidence made it more difficult for anyone to believe the crime had been spontaneous. The defense, however, tried to offer a different picture. They argued that Oishee had been pushed to the breaking point by years of pressure and control. Witnesses were brought forward to testify about her declining mental health, her substance abuse, and her growing sense of isolation. Psychologists explained how her perception of her parents' love had twisted into something oppressive, how she may have seen no other escape from the world they had built around her. The defense did not deny her actions but sought to explain them as the result of a troubled mind, rather than cold-blooded malice. Throughout the trial, Oishee sat quietly, her face often unreadable. When the prosecution described the murders, she remained still. When the defense spoke of her struggles, she occasionally lowered her gaze, but offered no visible emotion. For many in the courtroom, her silence was more haunting than any words could have been. The absence of remorse in her expressions fueled the belief that she had detached completely from what she had done. The trial captivated the nation. News outlets broadcast daily updates, and every development sparked fierce debate. Some people believed Oishee was a victim of her parents' harsh expectations, a young woman who had collapsed under unbearable pressure. Others saw her as a manipulative murderer, someone who had chosen the darkest possible path and refused to accept responsibility. Families across the country whispered about the case at dinner tables. Parents questioned their own relationships with their children, and teenagers saw in Oishee a reflection of rebellion taken too far. When the time came for the verdict, the courtroom was silent. The judge delivered the decision slowly, carefully, outlining the evidence that could not be ignored: the confession, the forensic proof, the diary entries, and her behavior before and after the crime. Oishee Rahman was found guilty. The sentence was announced, and with it, the final chapter of a tragedy that had shocked an entire nation was sealed. As she was led away in handcuffs, some in the audience wept while others looked on in stunned silence. The once promising daughter of a respected family had now become a convicted killer, her name forever tied to the act of destroying the very people who had raised her. The weight of her choices had stripped her of a future, leaving her to face the consequences within the confines of a prison cell. For the Rahman family, the story ended in devastation. Anwar and Salma, once symbols of integrity and love, were remembered not only for their contributions, but for the way their lives ended at the hands of their own child. The family home, now empty, stood as a ghostly reminder of the violence that had unfolded within its walls. Neighbors who once admired it, now avoided looking at it for too long, unable to erase the image of what had happened inside. The legacy of the case extended beyond the courtroom. It became a cautionary tale, a story retold in classrooms, newspapers, and living rooms. It forced parents to question whether control could sometimes suffocate rather than protect, and it forced children to confront the dangerous consequences of unchecked anger and rebellion. The tragedy of Oishee Rahman was not only that she had killed her parents, but that the fractures within the family had been invisible until it was too late to heal them. In the end, the story of the Rahmans became a haunting reminder that darkness can grow quietly within the walls of even the most respected homes. It showed that the bond between parents and children, when twisted by misunderstanding, silence and control, could turn from love into something unrecognizable. And for Oishee, The weight of her actions ensured that the name she carried would forever be linked not with promise or potential, but with betrayal, loss, and the irreversible destruction of her own family.